Honor and pleasure to be here with my teacher and friend, Professor Zvi Zohar, who is a scholar of many things, but in particular of the development of halachah, of Jewish law, and with a particular interest in the tradition of Sephardic rabbis. So thanks for taking a little time to talk.
Pleasure.
So just for those who this may be a little bit new, to oversimplify, Ashkenazi Jews are typically Jews from Europe, typically of white skin, although not always. And Sephardic Jews are typically from the Northern Africa, Mediterranean area, oftentimes Jews of color, but not always. And so what I want to look at a little bit today is you've identified three phases of the modern development of the Sefardic halachic process. And I wonder if you could identify those three for us. Yeah.
Okay, so if we're talking like about the 18th, 19th, the first part of the 20th century, so we have people, great rabbis, very learned, all around the Mediterranean area and the Middle East, in Algiers, Casablanca, Marrakesh, Egypt, Cairo, Alexandria, Beirut, Iraq, Baghdad, and so on, who, on the one hand, are responding to changes, because unlike what many people believe, there were changes and European influences and development in these countries. So the rabbis are responding to these, but they're doing it in, they're not really worried that modernity, they don't feel as a threat. It's a change, it's interesting. A lot of it is full of opportunity that until then wasn't present. And the rabbis feel that halakha could respond, preserving its own integrity in interesting and new ways to the interesting and new conditions. So that's phase one. And that runs until about, for the 1950, 1960. After World War II, young people from halachic, from Sephardic backgrounds that are interested in rabbinic studies from North Africa and the Middle East began to be drawn into the orbit of the Haredi world because they, either people from Europe after the war come to start Haredi yeshivot, and they take people from Morocco and to yeshivot in France, and Sunderland in Great Britain, and Mir in New York, and then some of them come to Israel, and in Israel, some of them become very secular, Shomer Tzair, socialist, but others get drawn into the Haredi orbit, and they go to Haredi yeshivot, and some of them are very successful. And so now we have young rabbis from the 60s and 70s who are Sephardic ethnically, but they have been trained in the worldview of the Haredi world, and they identify with that. And then about 1980, they began to feel that there's like a glass ceiling. Although they may be very successful in their studies, they're never going to be offered a position as a teacher in a Haredi yeshiva. The head of the yeshiva, who traditionally looks for shidduch for his daughter from the outstanding student, is never going to choose one of them to marry his daughter. The Haredim have a very ethnic consciousness in that respect. And so these people who are Haredi in outlook, but dissatisfied with this denigration of their background, get together and they form Shas, which is Haredi Sephardic.
Right.
So then, as time goes on and Shas gains in influence and power and establishes their own yeshivot and their own forms of study, and all of these younger people are now middle-aged and they get to be the Rosh Yeshiva and the head of the Kollel, but they're taking all of the young men from a Sephardic ethnic background who speak Hebrew with Het and Ayin, and maybe they eat ethnically Sephardic foods, and they say we only go according to the Shulchan Aruch, not according to the Ashkenazi, but their whole ethos is Haredi. And that has been going on for quite some time now, and now we're like about almost 40 years after the founding of Shas. And the third phase is one which I have begun to see intimations of in the Israeli scene and maybe also elsewhere of people from within that world who studied in the yeshivot but are beginning to somehow return to the original Sephardic attitude pre-Shas, pre-Haredi, and there's initial glimmerings and indications of that move, which I'm now very interested in.
What's that confidence and that intrigue coming from?
Well, I think it's coming from several sources. One is that as time goes by, so not everybody, but at least some of the people begin to say, well, let's really look at those sources of these rabbis that we know about, but we never studied in the Haredi yeshivot, and they see different attitudes there. Secondly, there's a lot more
Right.
people in the field, so some of them are, not all of them,
Yeah.
are beginning to open up. And thirdly, a thing that greatly contributed to this, paradoxically, is the decease of Rabbi Ovadia Yosef in 2013, because he had a very commanding and dominating position, and he didn't brook anybody to hold views other than his own. He would never concede,
Right.
you might also have a point. No, he was 100% sure that he had it right.
Right. Right.
And so now that he passed away, there's beginning to open up more options for people thinking on their own.
Great. So what are a few examples in that third era where there might be halachic positions that would be would have resonated from earlier modern Sephardic rabbis that would be at odds with some of the Haredi Sephardic approaches today?
Well, one individual that has received a lot of attention because he sort of like came out with this and said this expressly is Rabbi Chaim Amsalem of Israel, who's now about 55, 56, around that area. And he used to be a member of Knesset from Shas. And then when he came out with his own views, which are in line with now, I know him well, and he holds whose great heroes are Rabbi Uziel, Rabbi Yosef Massas, people from that pre-Shas, pre-Haredi great rabbi. So he came out and he said, people should really work. The Jewish ethos is that people shouldn't sit and study Torah all the time and get paid for that, and that should be their living. The great Sefardic rabbis, Maimonides, never thought of being supported. Even Rabbi Ovadia Yosef never thought that his wife should go out and support him. He worked as a rabbi, but that's work, that's fair enough, but he didn't get paid for just studying his whole life. Then he said, army service. All of his sons, they served in the IDF. Giur, he came out and he wrote a very impressive book about this, that conversion to becoming Jewish doesn't require that the person is now going to be 100% from Orthodox, and there's room to be more flexible in that, especially given the other options, what's going to happen if we don't take a lot of more people in. Right. So that's Rabbi Chaim Amsalem. I just recently met in Washington a very interesting person called Rabbi Chaim Ovadia, who comes from a Iraqi famous rabbinic family, and other people in his family are Haredim. Yeah. He has a sister who's a professor in Ben Greener, and he has a lot of very classic Sephardic rulings in Halachah. And then about a year ago, somebody showed me a document. Actually, two people. I'll start with. In 2003, a rabbi who, until I came across his book, I had never heard of, and I heard about this from Dr. Ronit Irshai of Bar-Ilan University, who's in gender studies. And this friend is called Idan Ben Ephraim, and he wrote a whole book called Dor Tahapuchot, which is a biblical phrase meaning a generation of transformations. And the whole book is devoted to people who are changing their gender identity.
Right.
And what do you do about that?
Yes.
And this person used to be with their birth assigned gender identity was male, now they're female. How should they dress? Where should they sit in the synagogue? And all many things like that. And this to date is the only full-length halachic book dealing with this. And the background he writes in the introduction, he said he didn't give much thought about this. Now, 2003, that's more than 15 years ago, so even transgender issues weren't big in the general society. So he said he works a lot with Kiruv. Okay, that's one of the things. The Sephardic rabbis, in the Ashkenazic Haredi world, you are choser b'tshuva, meaning you're sort of changing 180 degrees your attitude toward Jewish religiosity. But in the Sephardic world, no, you're mitchazek, you're becoming stronger because everybody is somewhere along the continuum. Okay, that's how the Sephardim view it, and that's how their community is built. So there was some young man that he was working with that said, I'm beginning to observe Shabbat and this, I really enjoy it. He says, my younger brother, sees how I'm enjoying it, so he also wants. But he said, there's a certain issue. My brother is now my sister. And Rabbi Idam Ben Ephraim said, I started asking older rabbis about this. I see they didn't have a clue. They didn't have a clue. So he said, so I'm not telling you, he says, that I'm in favor of people switching their gender identity. But that's not the issue. The issue is here people did it.
Right.
Now, how do we integrate them within the community?
Right.
How do we help them find their place in the community in this new situation? And he wrote a whole book about that. And the final example, which I'll give, is, in fact, connected to what we talked about a year ago. One person I never heard of, also Rabbi Hanan Aflalo. Aflalo is a Moroccan family name. And somebody said, I came across this. In fact, he got it from Rabbi Dov Linzer.
Oh, interesting.
And how Rabbi Dov Linzer, who has this podcast, about the joys of text. So how he came about this, I don't know. But it says this text is from the Responsa series Asher Hanan, published by Rabbi Hanan Aflalo, authored by Rabbi Hanan Aflalo, volume 8 from 2013. I said, wow. So in 2013, this was volume 8 of a series, and I didn't know this whole thing was going on. And the question is, somebody's asking him from the working class town of Or Akiva, which is sort of between Hadera and Haifa in Israel. He says, look, I'm also working with people who are mitchazkim, becoming stronger in their identity. And there's a couple, they began Shomer Shabbos, and they koshered their kitchen and this, and he says, but they're living together. They're not married. Maybe they'll get married a couple of years, not now. Should I advise the woman to go every month to the mikvah? That's the fellow from Or Akiva is asking Rabbi Hanan Aflalo. Rabbi Hanan Aflalo says, you know what? You asked me because you know that I already expressed an opinion about this. He says, there's a lot of rabbis that tell you that if people aren't married, it's forbidden to go to the mikvah. You're not allowed to go to the mikvah. And he says, but where are all these rabbis living? They're living in all of these Haredi communities. Bnei Brak, Jerusalem, Beit, all these other Haredi enclaves, and therefore they feel that they're in Gan Eden. And they don't have to take into account the real life issues of people who aren't already Haredi. He says, and they make believe that there's no such thing in the Haredi community. He says to the fellow in Or Akiva, you and me, we're not living in Gan Eden. We're living in Gan Hayot, a zoo. He says, look what's happening in reality. So if people are now living together as a committed couple, that's a big thing, and we should encourage the woman, to go to mikvah, and that will give weight and seriousness
Yeah,
to their
yeah.
relationship.
Right.
And then when they get married, they will be part of their daily. And certainly that's what we should do. Now, that's exactly the type of considerations that were characteristic of the classic Sephardic rabbis of the pre-Haredi time.
Yeah, beautiful. So, okay, last question for you, because I know we could talk about this forever. Looking back at that first era, what is it about the Sephardi poskim that enabled them in many ways to be more inclusive, more expansive? And how much of that is just about the individuals that were involved versus kind of the church culture of Ashkenaz and ideology of Europe versus sort of a more Islamic or ideology of Northern Africa and Middle East? And so what is it about Sefardic Halachah that develops so differently?
Well, there's two factors here. One is that in Europe, modern times, modern Jewish society is characterized by a series of intense schisms. Even before modernity really comes along, you have the Hasidim against the Mitnagdim, and that's really very hardcore, and people are really hating each other's guts. Then soon after that, you get the emancipation, the Haskalah. People feel they're very modernized. They look down at traditional Judaism. Then comes reform, and in response to reform come people who later call themselves Orthodox, and they said reform want to change this and this and this. It doesn't even begin to think about that because HaChadash, Asur Min Torah, whatever new is inherently forbidden by Torah. Torah means...
So lots of tensions,
And so people define themselves by going against and negating the other positions.
Well, and anti-Semitism is a little bit more robust, right? That's another tension.
Well, certainly, but you might think that for a certain period in the 18th century, in the beginning of the 19th century, people felt that emancipation, equality, and they could integrate into the surrounding society, and that's what gave impetus to people becoming socialists and this and that. So in that sense, these schisms weren't characteristic of the Sephardic world, and a lot of that had to do also with the Sephardic rabbis trying to bend over backward, not to exclude anybody. So that became part of their response to don't exclude anybody. The second thing is that from medieval times, from Gaonic times, it was very typical of great rabbis in the Middle East to integrate general knowledge, universal knowledge, sciences, philosophy with the Jewish identity, and they didn't feel that everything out there was a threat, and they could integrate it. And the Sephardic way of ruling in halakha is we don't follow this rabbi or that. Anybody that wrote anything within the rabbinic world, we should study that and learn from him. And once you do that, you see that whatever we now practice in halakha in our community at this time, that's only a fraction of the tremendous spectrum and richness that exists within halakhic sources over the times and generations and places. And once you could tap into that, you could find different things that may not be right now conventional, but they're within halakha, and they could really be helpful in solving real life problems that until now maybe in our community we weren't facing. And because of all these resources and this outlook, this enabled them to.
So in fact, that second era, one of the other signs of the assimilation into the Haredi culture is the fact this Das Torah with Avadia Yosef. This sense of one authority as opposed to this more expansive notion. Right. Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much, Professor Zohar. Make sure to check out his wonderful books and writings. We will share his other lectures coming up soon as well. Thanks so much.